My name is Carol Reyes. I'm 59 years old, and I paid $51,000 for my son's wedding. At the reception, my new daughter-in-law lifted her champagne glass, looked straight at me in front of 200 guests, and announced that the greatest gift I could give the newlyweds was to disappear from their lives forever. The room went silent. Somewhere behind her, the cellist's bow froze mid-stroke. My son stared at the floor like it owed him an explanation. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I set my glass down carefully, walked out to the veranda, and made a single phone call. What happened over the following 15 minutes, and the 10 days after, is a story that bride will regret provoking for the rest of her life. But to understand why, you need to know what 9 years of silence had actually been buying. Because in my family, nobody ever asked where the money came from. They only asked when it was arriving next. If you're the kind of woman who keeps the family afloat and still ends up cropped out of the picture, stay with me. This one's for you. 9 years ago, my husband Marcus died on a job site in the Midwest. An aneurysm, they said, sudden and merciless. He was 54. I was 50. Our son Ethan was 22, fresh out of college with a business degree, a used sedan, and absolutely no idea how to grieve. People always ask how I survived that first year. The truth is boring. Spreadsheets. Grief, it turns out, generates an enormous amount of paperwork, and paperwork was the one language I still understood fluently. I had built a bookkeeping practice out of our spare bedroom over 2 decades, 11 employees by then, half the small businesses in the county trusting me with their books. So when the hospital billed us, I audited every line. When the insurance company dragged its feet, I called every single morning until they stopped dragging. When the funeral director tried to upsell me a package deal with a straight face, I demanded an itemized breakdown and watched the total drop by nearly $1,000 on the spot. Numbers never abandoned me. Marcus used to joke that I trusted a spreadsheet more than most people trusted scripture. He wasn't entirely wrong. What I didn't understand back then, standing in a house gone quiet, surrounded by folders where a marriage used to live, was that when you lose the person you talk to, you keep talking anyway, just in whatever language is left to you. Mine was money. Every time Ethan called, I'd hear echoes of his father's laugh underneath his voice, and whatever he needed, I'd already decided to give him before he finished asking. The first check I wrote him came 4 days after the funeral. $1,100 for rent he was short on. It was the first of many, and I want to be honest, that's on me. Here's the thing about my son. People adore him instantly. Servers remember his order. Elderly women at his church save him extra pie. He can walk into a room of strangers and leave with 3 new invitations to golf. And every bit of it is sincere. That part came straight from his father. But Ethan never technically asked me for money. He just mentioned things, and it took me years to understand that mentioning and asking are not the same crime. He'd call on a Sunday, we'd talk football for 20 minutes, and then, almost as an afterthought, he'd sigh about a mechanic's quote or a friend's bachelor trip. By Tuesday, the money would already be sitting in his account, because I'd sent it before he ever had to lower himself to a direct request. He never had to ask. I never got to be asked. The transfers just happened, quiet as a furnace clicking on, and we both pretended the warmth arrived on its own. At work, I was known for a particular lecture. I'd sit some overwhelmed young couple down and tell them, if you can't see it written in the ledger, it isn't generosity, it's a leak. I must have given that speech 100 times. Then I'd drive home and wire my son $400 for a golf trip he'd casually brought up. I balanced strangers' books for a living and refused, for years, to add up my own. The mentions simply got larger. Slowly. Politely. Like a tide coming in without anyone announcing it. Then, 6 years ago, on an ordinary Thursday, my phone rang. It was a debt counselor, and I could hear Ethan's voice, thin and rattled, somewhere in the background. Nobody was mentioning anything anymore. The number on the table was blunt. $42,000, spread across 5 credit cards and an auto loan he never should have signed. He sat at my kitchen table with his ears burning red, 25 years old and looking exactly like he had at 9, the day he put a baseball through our neighbor's window. I paid it off in full that Monday. But I did something that surprised him, something I did because of a phrase Marcus used to repeat whenever a client wanted to shake hands instead of sign anything. Paper keeps love honest. I drew up a promissory note. A demand note, the kind that can be called due whenever the lender decides. Principal, $42,000. Interest set at the federal rate, exactly what the IRS requires if you don't want a loan reclassified as a gift. Payable on demand to me. I'm a bookkeeper by trade. If I'm going to love someone with money, the paperwork is going to be flawless. He signed it without reading past the first paragraph, grinning, calling it a formality. We ordered takeout that night like nothing had happened. Every December after that, I quietly forgave that year's accrued interest with a one-line letter, exactly what tax law allows, and filed each letter away in a folder he never knew existed. He never made a payment on the principal. I never once asked for one. For 6 years, both of those facts felt like devotion. It would take a wedding to show me what they actually were. The house came a year later. By then, Ethan's credit was wrecked from the debt spiral, and no lender in the state would touch him for a mortgage. His rent, meanwhile, was quietly draining him dry. That spring, an estate sale put a handsome brick two-story on the market, 3 bedrooms, an oak tree older than the block, 20 minutes from my place, listed at $310,000. I could afford it. That's not bragging, that's simply what 28 years of overtime, a paid-off office, and a life insurance payout add up to. I bought it outright in my own name. I want to be clear that keeping the deed wasn't about control or stinginess. It was because I had just watched my son excavate a $42,000 hole with a shovel called optimism. So I sat him down and laid it out plainly. This is my house, you live in it, you pay rent, and when your footing is solid, we'll talk about putting your name on the deed like adults. $900 a month. The going rate on that street was closer to $2,300, and we both knew it. He hugged me, called it Mom's discount, and moved in that fall. My friends at church called me generous. My sister Denise called me a pushover. Neither of them knew the whole truth, because nobody knew what I quietly did with that $900 every single month. I opened an account the week he moved in, at the same branch I'd used since the 80s. Every rent payment he made landed in my checking account first, and every month, untouched, I moved it into that separate account with his name on the file tab in my desk drawer. He believed he was paying me rent. He was actually paying his future self. I used to sit with my coffee on the first of every month, watching that balance climb, imagining the day I'd finally hand it to him. A wedding, a grandchild, some unremarkable Tuesday when he asked how I was doing before asking me for anything at all. 60 months. $900 at a time. $54,000. Sitting there like a gift wrapped so early you forget which closet it's hidden in. Denise called it a safety net. That's the charitable read. The truthful one has sharper edges. I think I was building evidence. A number I could someday point to and say, see? I loved you the whole time. It's all right here in writing. As if devotion could be escrowed. As if my own son would eventually audit my heart and I needed to pass inspection. I knew exactly how that sounded even as I kept doing it, because it was the only sentence in our shared language I still knew how to speak. Then one Sunday 3 years ago, Ethan called with a lift in his voice I hadn't heard since before his father died. Mom, he said. I met someone. Her name was Brooke Sinclair. 26, an event planner, polished the way a catalog page is polished. The first time she walked through my door, she complimented my crown molding before she said hello to me. She brought wine with a bow on it and called my home so charming, so lived in, and I told myself nerves make young women sound like real estate agents. I genuinely wanted to like her. I need that on record. I asked about her family and got a smooth, rehearsed paragraph in return. Her father in the furniture business, her mother chairing every charity committee within 50 miles. It was so polished it had clearly been recited before. But her eyes told a different story all through dinner. They tracked along my bookshelves, my china cabinet, the framed photos on the mantel, not the way a guest looks around a room, but the way an appraiser does. She was pricing everything. I caught it between the salad course and the roast, and something in me went quiet and alert, the way you feel one wrong note land in a hymn you've sung your whole life. Then she raised her glass, tilted it toward my son, and toasted, self-made men. My son. Sitting in a house he didn't own. Driving on tires I'd quietly financed that February. Ethan raised his own glass and said nothing to correct the record. My son toasted a version of himself that didn't exist, and drank to it. I smiled and laughed along because that's what you do at a pleasant dinner. But underneath the table, I gripped my fork a little tighter and thought, one person at this table is fiction, and apparently I'm the only one not voting for him. 2 springs ago, Ethan proposed at sunset on a dock, and the Sinclairs threw an engagement party with a champagne tower and a photographer barking candid, candid, while arranging guests by height. I stood wherever I was placed. Brooke's mother, Pamela, worked that patio like she was campaigning for office, her voice pitched perfectly to Carrie. We just adore Ethan. He fits this family like he was made for it. Made for it. I filed that phrase away with the others. Denise appeared at my elbow with 2 glasses and the stage whisper she'd perfected over 30 years of teaching 2nd grade, a whisper built to carry across a gymnasium. Did I know their furniture stores had gone under? That the bank took their lake house back in 2009? That Pamela told everyone they were simplifying? I told her to hush, but I'd already heard fragments of the same story twice, and pieces of it were starting to click against things I'd quietly noticed myself. The leased car that wasn't quite as new as it looked, the country club membership they never actually used. A family working overtime to maintain appearances is its own kind of exhausted, and I know exhausted when I see it. What actually unsettled me that night was my son's pronouns. All evening, we're thinking of fall wedding. We want a vineyard. We feel strongly about live music. Every we had Brooke folded inside it. None of them had me. A mother notices the exact day she gets edited out of her own son's sentences. I kept my church smile on. You'll see that smile again. It makes a return at the reception. Everyone agreed the wedding would be beautiful. Nobody asked, out loud, who would be footing the bill. That question, like every expensive question in my family, had already been quietly assigned to me without a vote. The invoices never came to me directly. They arrived sideways, which was the family specialty. Ethan would call on a Sunday, we'd cover football, and then, almost incidentally, the vineyard venue needed its deposit by Friday, $14,000. Venues are just insane these days, right? A sigh shaped exactly like an invoice. I want to tell you I hesitated. We'd been running this exact play for 9 years, and muscle memory doesn't ask permission. I wired the $14,000 by Wednesday. Then the caterer, the florist, the string quartet. Brooke felt strongly about a photographer who used a drone, and a baker who charged by the individual sugar flour. By wedding week, my total outlay sat at $51,000, and yes, I could show you the ledger, because of course I kept one, every invoice tabbed, every confirmation stapled. Force of habit. And if I'm honest, force of something sadder. Here's what actually stung. I was funding a celebration I was learning about secondhand. There was a group chat for wedding planning. I wasn't in it. Decisions arrived to me as finished announcements. The palette is sage and ivory. The ceremony's at 5. The dinner is plated, not buffet. Months before the wedding, Pamela hosted a brunch and tapped her mimosa glass to announce, to 40 guests, how thrilled she was to be hosting this wedding for both families. Hosting. I had wired her florist that same morning. I sat there with my eggs going cold, running the math silently, the way I always did. Then the invitations came back from the printer, heavy cream cardstock. Genuinely lovely. I found my own name on the guest list, just nowhere near the top where hosts' names are supposed to go. 3 weeks before the wedding, I opened the wedding website Brooke had built. There was a page titled Our Story, written entirely in her voice, describing a self-made man named Ethan Reyes who'd hustled through his 20s, debt-free and driven, who'd bought his first home before 30. Beneath that line sat a photograph of my house, my oak tree glowing gold in the corner of the frame. My house, presented online as proof of a man I had personally financed into existence, $42,000 at a time. I did not simmer quietly. I called my son that night and told him the page needed to come down or come clean, that a marriage built on a fabricated resume was a structural hazard. And then I said the harder thing. Brooke needs to know the truth about the house, about the loan, before the wedding, not after. You don't let a woman marry a man who doesn't exist. A long silence stretched on the line. Then my son, in the same gentle tone he uses to calm difficult clients, told me she already knew everything. She just didn't like discussing money. Her family was weird about it. Please don't turn this into a thing. I've replayed that sentence more times than I can count. I sat on that truth for 3 more weeks, on my own son's word alone. 2 weeks before the wedding, the Sinclairs invited us to dinner, and I finally saw inside the house Pamela liked to call the cottage. It was beautiful the way a staged showroom is beautiful right before liquidation. Good bones, careful lighting, and if you looked twice, pale rectangles on the wallpaper where paintings used to hang. Nobody notices rectangles like that unless they've spent a career noticing what's missing from a balance sheet. I got lost looking for the powder room and wandered into the back hallway, and that's where I heard them, Pamela and Brooke, in the kitchen, water running. Pamela's voice had dropped all its committee luncheon polish. It was low, hard, a voice with the studs showing. You keep smiling through Saturday, and you keep smiling after. We don't owe anyone anything anymore. Remember that. And Brooke, small and young, answered like she was reciting something drilled into her since childhood. I know, Mom. I remember. I stood in that hallway with my hand on the wall, doing what I always do, placing numbers where the fog was. The store failing in 2009. The lake house repossessed. College paid for on loans nobody discussed. This family hadn't just lost money. They'd been publicly, humiliatingly amputated from their own image of themselves. And Pamela had spent 15 years teaching her daughter that owing anyone anything was how you bled out. Every debt a leash. Every giver, eventually a handler. I felt sorry for Brooke Sinclair for exactly the length of that hallway. It explained everything and excused nothing. When I returned to the dining room, she glanced up at me automatically and priced my coat. Understanding where a person's venom comes from doesn't make the bite any less real. It just tells you where she'll aim. The small humiliations arrived like a slow drip after that. First, my toast. I'd asked for 3 minutes at the reception. Mother of the groom, a modest tradition older than either of our families. Brooke called personally, all warmth. The timeline was simply too tight. The planner said toasts were where receptions went to die. Surely I understood. The maid of honor kept her toast. Pamela kept hers. Mine quietly died in committee. Then the seating chart leaked through Denise, who plays cards with the wedding planner's aunt. A head table for the bridal party, a family table for the Sinclairs, and me, assigned to table 9. I checked the floor plan, the one my own money had paid to print. Table 9 sat directly beside the kitchen doors. Then the printed program arrived for proofing, and beneath, hosted by, in tasteful italics, it read only the Sinclair family. My name appeared nowhere on a piece of cardstock my florist invoice was quietly subsidizing. I called my son and asked him one direct question. Is this what you actually want, or just what you're too tired to stop? He gave me the client voice again. It's just details, Mom. It's her day, you're bigger than a seating chart. That same afternoon I paid the florist's final invoice, $6,400, because in my line of work, whoever signs the check is whoever holds the say. Weddings, apparently, run on different accounting, one where the signature and the authority live in separate rooms. I remember thinking that girl was working awfully hard to erase one grandmother-aged woman from the picture. What I hadn't figured out yet was why my presence frightened her so much. 10 days before the wedding, Ethan showed up alone, which almost never happened anymore. He sat at the same kitchen table where his signature sat folded in a drawer upstairs and circled the runway for a good 20 minutes. Football, my garden, whether I'd ever considered a cruise. I poured coffee and let him land the plane in his own time. I've spent 30 years watching nervous clients stall, and the ones circling longest always carry the heaviest ask. Finally, he said it, that with the wedding coming up, it would mean everything if I signed the house over to both of them as a wedding gift. He said it fast, like a man ripping tape off skin, and then added the sentence that told me exactly whose words these really were. It's basically ours anyway, Mom. I set my cup down. Basically. I let that word sit between us the way I'd let a bad number sit unaddressed on a client's desk. Not cruel, just visible. Here's what I actually heard underneath it, and I want you to hear it too. Not greed exactly. A script. My son doesn't casually say basically ours about a house he pays a fifth of market rent on. A man says that after someone has been whispering it to him patiently, in the dark, for months. I told him the truth. That's a significant piece of paper, sweetheart, and significant paper gets handled properly after the honeymoon with the tax implications done right. Not rushed between the caterer and the cake. He nodded too quickly. equal parts relieved and disappointed, and drove back to the house I still owned. I sat there with my cold coffee and made a very different kind of appointment. My attorney, Frank Delgado, has represented me for 20 years and was Marcus's poker buddy for 15 before that. Corner office, terrible coffee, and the calm of a man who's seen every configuration a family can twist itself into. I laid it all out for him like tax documents. The demand note, still untouched at 42,000 plus years of accrued goodwill. The deed solely in my name. The will, which at that point left everything to Ethan outright. Then I told him what I actually wanted to do, and his eyebrows went up and then came back down, and he smiled the particular smile he only breaks out maybe twice a year. Here was the plan. A cashier's check for $54,000, every rent payment Ethan had ever made me, all 60 of them, finally coming home to him. The note, stamped and forgiven in full, a genuine wedding gift. A signed letter of intent that after the honeymoon, once appraisals and gift tax filings were properly handled, the deed would transfer cleanly, the way Marcus would have wanted it done. All of it, sealed in one plain envelope, tucked into my clutch, ready to hand over at the reception, quietly, after the toasts I wasn't giving. Let Pamela have the microphone. I'd have the envelope. Frank asked the question he's paid to ask, and if the girl turns out to be exactly what you're afraid she is? I looked out his window at the parking lot for a long moment before answering. I'd rather find that out, I told him, while the deed still has my name on it. I carried that envelope for 10 days. Not once did I imagine the version of that night where it stayed zipped inside my purse. Word of my decision, no transfer until after the honeymoon done correctly, took about a day to travel from Ethan to Brooke, and the temperature in that family dropped like an early frost. Nothing you could photograph. Everything you could feel. The final dress fitting I'd been invited to months earlier quietly became, just us girls, you understand. My texts got answered hours later, one clipped line at a time. Thanks noted, we'll see, punctuation like a closing door. At the last fitting, Denise went in my place, armed with peppermints and a talent for eavesdropping. Pamela stood among the tulle and said to no one in particular, pitched for exactly one set of ears. Some people only hold on to things to feel needed. Sad, really, using a house like a leash. Denise reported it back to me the way she used to report playground crimes, verbatim. And there it was, Pamela's entire worldview laid bare. Every gift a chain. Every giver, eventually a warden. I understood the sermon Brooke had been raised on a little more clearly each week. Understanding it, I should say plainly, changed nothing about what was already in motion. Then Brooke made her one direct move on me. She called, sweet as frosting, explaining that the planner was rebalancing the room, and that table 9 actually had the best view of the dance floor, honestly, and she just thought I'd be more comfortable with a little breathing room, rather than crowded up front with the bridal party. More comfortable. I have buried a husband. I have audited an entire school district's books. I raised a boy who once nearly set our garage on fire, testing a science project. I have never once in my life required breathing room from my own family. I thanked her warmly for thinking of my comfort. Then I hung up and signed the caterer's final invoice, because the food, at least, would tell the truth. The rehearsal dinner was the Sinclairs' one contribution, $3,200 at a steakhouse, and I know the figure because Pamela mentioned it twice, the way you'd mention an old war wound. She stood between courses, glass raised, and delivered a speech about what it meant for her family to give these two young people their beginning. The room made the warm sound rooms make. My son sat there and let every word of it stand. That was the moment Denise nearly came out of her chair. I felt her inhaled beside me. 30 years of managing second graders gives a woman a certain launch capacity. I put my hand on her wrist and pressed down. It's his wedding, I murmured. They're toasting themselves with money that paid for those exact flowers, she hissed back. I know, I said. I processed the invoice. She stared at me like I'd lost my mind. And some nights, I think a part of me wanted to stand up right then and read the whole ledger aloud. But you cannot audit a fairy tale in the middle of its telling. Nobody thanks you for it, and the pages just get wet. So I ate my steak and complimented the venue with the face I reserve for tax auditors, and under the tablecloth, I ran my thumb along the edge of my clutch, where the white envelope waited like a passport to a country I still believed we were all traveling toward together. 2 more days, and the truth could come out on my own terms in Frank's office, with the paperwork clean and nobody's makeup at risk. I want it noted somewhere, mine was the kind version of this plan. I arrived at the vineyard 2 hours early on the wedding day, because 30 years of tax seasons had permanently ruined me for showing up anywhere unprepared. The venue genuinely looked like $51,000. White chairs in perfect rows between the vines, sage and ivory table runners, a 6-tier cake being leveled with a tiny spirit level by a woman I deeply respected in that moment. And here's what I noticed. Walking that beautiful lawn in my mother-of-the-groom heels, every single vendor on the property came looking for me. Not the bride. Not Pamela, self-appointed host of hosts. The florist's crew chief needed a substitution approved. The caterer had a question about the vegetarian head count. The photographer confirmed the shot list with the client of record, me, per the contract. One by one, the people actually doing the work found the woman whose signature was on their checks, and one by one, I sent them off satisfied. Then the venue coordinator appeared, a polite young man with a clipboard and a lanyard, and confirmed the evening's schedule and mentioned, almost in passing, that the balance due tonight would run on the same card as the deposit, correct? I said yes without even looking up from the floor plan. Remember that clipboard. It has a role to play later. Through the window of the bridal suite above me, I could see my son wrestling with his bow tie, laughing with his groomsmen, and my chest did the thing it does, pride and grief holding hands. Everything beautiful in that vineyard had my name on it somewhere, on a contract, on a receipt, on a deed. By sunset, thanks to one courteous man with a clipboard, the whole tent would know it. And so finally would the bride. The ceremony itself was, honestly, perfect. Golden light through the vines, a string quartet threading something classical across the rows, Brooke coming down the aisle looking like a magazine cover that costs more than the other magazines. My son cried at the sight of her, and I cried at the sight of him, because underneath the fiction and the borrowed pronouns, he was still the boy who'd carried his father's casket with his jaw locked like poured concrete. A mother's eyes don't come with an off switch. Then the vows. Ethan thanked God. He thanked his fiancée. He thanked Pamela and the entire Sinclair family for making the day possible. His words carried out over speakers my deposit had rented, across 200 chairs my card had secured, and none of it, not one syllable, landed anywhere near me. I sat in the second row, Denise's hand closed over mine, and watched the videographer's camera sweep across family faces and glide right past me, the way a lens slides past an empty seat. A few heads turned briefly, Marie from my office, an old friend from Bridge Club. Eyes that said, quietly, we see you, even if the microphone doesn't. I kept my church smile bolted in place and ran my thumb along the stiff edge of the envelope in my lap. It steadied me, that edge. Let them have their speeches, I thought. Speeches evaporate. What I held in my lap was $54,000 of patience, a forgiven debt, and a house. The truth, wrapped in paper, waiting for the right quiet moment. I had one gift left to give, and one thing left to lose. By 10 o'clock that night, I would be holding neither. The reception tent glowed like the inside of a pearl, and my assigned seat sat hard against the swinging kitchen doors. Every time a tray of duck passed through, warm gravy-scented air swept across my shoulder, and the busboys learned to steer wide around my chair like I was a traffic cone. My place card read, Carla Reyes. I took out my pen and corrected the single letter, cleanly, and set it back on its little stand, because if the evening intended to misfile me, it could at least misfile me accurately. Denise, exiled to my table by association, read the card and said something I won't repeat inside a church. Eat your duck, I told her. We're being gracious tonight. And honestly, I could hold most of it at arm's length. The table, the missing toast, all of it, because of the small, bright plan glowing quietly in my lap. Once the cake was cut, I'd pull my son and his bride aside and hand them $54,000, a forgiven debt and a promise deed. Let the seating chart say whatever it wanted. The last word of the night was going to be generosity, and it was going to be mine. The toasts ended. The band shifted into something livelier. And across the tent, I saw the venue coordinator, lanyard swinging, clipboard raised, weaving through 200 guests, headed directly for table 9. He was a decent young man, I want that on record, because none of what followed was his fault. He had a job, and the job had a checklist, and the checklist said the balance was due tonight. He reached my chair during one of those brief pockets of quiet that open up in a loud room, like ice cracking underfoot, and he leaned in and said it at exactly clipboard volume. "Mrs. Reyes, the remaining balance on the venue and catering, we're running the same card as the deposit, correct? I just need one more signature." One more signature. In that small silence, the words carried 2 tables in every direction, the way water finds every crack in old stone. I saw Forks pause midair. I saw Marie close her eyes like a woman hearing a hymn confirmed. And 8 feet away, at the edge of the dance floor, I saw Pamela Sinclair, host of hosts, toastmaster of the Sinclair beginning, go absolutely still, her committee luncheon smile frozen in place while her eyes did fast, desperate arithmetic. I signed. What else does a woman like me do? I signed my own name on my own card, for my own son's wedding, folded the receipt into my clutch beside the envelope, and thanked the young man kindly. When I looked up, Pamela was already cutting through the crowd toward her daughter with the focused urgency of a woman handling a crisis. I watched her whisper into Brooke's ear. I watched my new daughter-in-law's expression change. Brooke set down her glass and started across the floor, the long way, collecting a bridesmaid's hand squeeze here, a cheek kiss there, so her arrival at my table would look like a bride making her rounds and not a woman closing distance with intent. Up close, her face was flawless and her eyes were doing the same inventory they'd done at that first dinner years ago, pricing the thread in front of her. She didn't lower her voice. "I need you to have that detail." She pitched it just loud enough to carry to every table that had already heard the clipboard. "Carol, I'm so glad I caught you. I've been wanting to say this all night." A small laugh, her glass half raised, the picture of a toast about to happen. "You've done so much, truly. Everyone knows how involved you like to be, which is why I hope you'll understand what I'm about to say, because I mean it with love." She let the silence stretch. She was an event planner down to her bones. She knew exactly how to hold a room's attention. "Ethan and I have everything we need now. So honestly, the best wedding gift you could possibly give us would be leaving this family for good." The gasp that followed was real. You've heard rooms gasp in movies. In real life it's quieter, and somehow worse. 100 small inhales at once. Ice going still in glasses, the cellist lifting her bow off the strings mid-note. Somewhere a fork rang against a plate like a tiny, horrified bell. Pamela didn't gasp. I noticed that. She simply watched, chin lifted, like a general reviewing a battlefield she'd already predicted. The champagne flute in my hand had gone suddenly cold, the stem thin as an icicle between my fingers, bubbles still climbing through it, stupidly festive, while 200 people waited to see whether the invisible woman at table 9 would cry, or scream, or shatter. I did none of those things. I turned my head and looked for exactly one person. Not Brooke. Brooke had just told me precisely who she was, on schedule in public. Nothing left to learn there. I looked past her, through the gap in the crowd, to my son. Ethan stood near the sweetheart table in his tuxedo, a boy I had once walked to his first day of kindergarten. He heard every word his wife said to his mother in front of 200 witnesses. And he looked down. He turned his new wedding band once around his finger, then again, and studied the floor like he was inspecting it for structural damage. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. You can live an entire lifetime inside 4 seconds. I aged 9 years in them, because there it was, the answer to the one question I had spent a decade paying, quite literally, not to have to ask. If the check stopped, if the wiring and the deposits and the quiet fixing all stopped, would anyone stay? I had purchased a full decade of not knowing that answer, $900 a month, $51,000 a wedding, and in the moment it finally arrived, my son found his own shoes more compelling than my face. The strange thing is what I actually felt in that instant. Not the blade I'd braced for. Something closer to the eerie calm that settles at the end of a brutal audit, when the number finally comes back bad. But at least, at long last, it's true. I looked out at the sweetheart table with its imported peonies, at the tent my card had raised, at the bride glowing with the confidence of a woman who believed she'd just successfully evicted an unwanted guest. And the entry wrote itself, clean as a line in a ledger. I was never a guest at this table. I was the table. So I stood. I set my champagne down, still full, beside the place card with its single corrected letter, and I walked unhurried, spine straight, my mother's posture, toward the terrace doors, pulling my phone from my clutch as I went. The terrace was strung with string lights, and the glass doors sealed shut behind me, turning the party into a silent aquarium. All that shimmer, none of the noise. Crickets sawed away in the vines. Bass thumped faintly through the glass. My hands did not shake. I want that on the record, too. Frank picked up on the third ring, because men his age with law licenses and 40 years of friendship always pick up, even on a Saturday night. Carol, aren't you at the wedding? I said. I'm on the terrace, Frank. I need you to take some instructions. A pause. Then quietly, go ahead. Call a note. Formal demand, full principal, 30 days. Include the installment option. I'm not trying to drown him, I'm trying to wake him. Draft a codicil removing Ethan and his wife from the will. I'll come in Wednesday to sign. And start the paperwork moving the house on Maple into my living trust this week. The crickets kept sawing. Somewhere behind the glass, the cake was being wheeled out to applause I couldn't hear. You're certain? Frank asked, not arguing, just confirming, the way he'd confirm a wire amount. I have never been more balanced in my life, I told him. Then I called the bank's after-hours line, the one they give clients who've been loyal for nearly 3 decades, and I stopped the standing transfers, the insurance, the phone plan, the small automatic kindnesses that had been running silently for years. Effective Monday. 14 minutes, both calls combined. I know because I checked, leaning on that cold stone railing, breathing in vineyard air. Understand, nothing legal actually happens in 14 minutes. No deed moves. No will changes. No debt comes due between the salad course and the cake. But a decision happens. A decision happens all at once, like a bone finally setting, and the paperwork simply follows behind it like a shadow catching up. I put my phone away and opened the glass doors. 15 minutes after my daughter-in-law asked 200 people to witness my banishment as a wedding gift, I walked back into that tent, and I did not go anywhere near the microphone. I want you to notice that, because people who retell this story always get that part wrong. There was no announcement. No raised voice. No receipts read aloud to a stunned crowd. No scene. That's her instrument, not mine. I crossed the floor while servers passed out slices of cake, and I came to my son, standing a little apart from his new wife, already pale around the mouth, the way people get when they sense weather changing. I put my hand on his sleeve, gently, for one set of ears only, a trick I'd apparently learned that very month. The note gets called Monday, I told him. You'll want to look closely at what you signed. The house moves into my trust this week. Frank will send everything in writing, so nobody has to rely on memory. He said, Mom, in a voice I hadn't heard since the day of the broken window. Brooke started toward us, radar fully engaged, too far away to have caught a single word. I patted his sleeve, the same 2 pats I'd given him at his father's graveside, and said, Enjoy the party. It's already paid for. Then I walked out, past the sweetheart table, past Pamela's frozen smile, past the gift table stacked with silver envelopes, my own clutch, envelope still sealed inside it, never even slowing. At the tent's entrance, the venue coordinator hovered, visibly aware by now of what his clipboard had set in motion. The band, he stammered, had offered to play an extra hour, but the overtime hadn't been authorized. I took his pen and signed it myself. $300, the last signature I'd put on that wedding. I signed it because the 200 people inside that tent had done nothing wrong, and because my name, whatever the program said, was still the one that meant something at that vineyard. Then I drove home. The drive was 40 minutes of dark 2-lane road and vineyard fencing, radio off, both hands steady on the wheel, at exactly the speed limit, the way you drive when some deep internal system has quietly switched over to backup power. The silence in that car was enormous. 9 years of noise, mentions, sighs, deposits, group chats I was never invited into, all of it shut off at once. And underneath it was a stillness so complete it practically rang in my ears. Denise called before I'd even cleared the parking lot, her headlights trailing me half the way home like a tugboat escort. Where are you? What did you do, Carol? I'll explain tomorrow, I told her. Nobody's hurt. Everybody's fine. Which was true. And also, depending on which ledger you used, the biggest lie I told all year. In my kitchen, I set my clutch on the counter, and the white envelope slid halfway out, sitting there under the stove light, fat with a cashier's check, a stamped and forgiven note, and a letter of intent, addressed not to nobody. $54,000 of patience with no forwarding address. I looked at it for a long while. No tears. No satisfaction either. I stood in a quiet house that belonged entirely to me and felt the floor hold steady beneath my feet, a sensation I genuinely recommend to anyone who's forgotten what it feels like. My phone lit up on the counter. Buzzed. Went dark. Lit again. Ethan. 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 I turned it face down, washed my single water glass, and went to bed like a woman closing out a brutal but honest fiscal year. Because in every way that counted, I had. Monday came, and Frank's letters went out exactly as instructed. By Wednesday, my son understood precisely what his life had actually cost, and so did his wife. Here's what went out, because I believe in showing my work. First, a formal demand on the promissory note, principal of $42,000 due within 30 days, exactly as the document he'd signed permitted, stapled behind it, because I remained his mother and not his repo agent, a ready-made installment plan, $200 a month to start, fully renegotiable, sign here, no drama required. Second, a notice to my tenants at the Maple House. Not an eviction. Read it twice, it genuinely wasn't one. 3 options in writing. Stay and pay full market rent like any other adult on that street, purchase the house outright at independent appraisal with a real mortgage in their own names, or take 90 days to relocate, 3 times the notice the law required, because I was raised better than that. Third, Frank's cover letter noting the codicil, signed that Wednesday at 10 in the morning with 2 witnesses and terrible decoff, confirming that the Maple Street deed was moving into my living trust, where it would sit safely, for as long as I pleased, far outside the reach of the word basically. Fourth, small, but real, the car insurance and phone plan quietly came apart that same week. The bank had already halted the standing transfers days earlier. Every single item came with an open door and a consequence stapled neatly beside it. I wasn't burning my son's life to the ground. I was, for the very first time, handing him the actual receipts for it. The voicemails started Tuesday and ran through the familiar stages: fury by noon, negotiation by dinner, a long silence, then finally a flat, careful voice clearly reading from someone else's script. I listened to each one with my coffee, the way I'd review a client file. It was the 4th voicemail that mattered, though, because underneath Ethan's voice, somewhere in the good acoustics of his own kitchen, I could hear a second voice rising behind him. He called Wednesday night and, carelessly, left it on speaker, hands clearly full of paperwork. I heard the whole scene the way you hear a play performed just off stage. My son's voice, close and strained, "You're really doing this, Mom, you're really," and behind him, Frank's envelopes being handled, pages turning fast, and then Brooke's voice, sharpening with every sentence, arriving in real time at the actual arithmetic of her own marriage. "What is this? Ethan, what is this? The deed says the house is hers. Why does it say the house is hers?" Paper rustling. "There's a note. You signed for $42,000. You told me the debt was a rumor your mother started." And then the sentence that told me everything about the foundation this courtship had actually been built on, delivered loud enough that the speaker couldn't soften it. "You let me marry a man who owns nothing." I stood at my counter, listening to a carefully constructed myth collapse inside a house I still legally owned. Whatever Brooke had priced during that first dinner years ago, the molding, the china, the light through the windows, every single appraisal was crumbling at once, and underneath her fury I could hear it plainly, the old Sinclair terror, the amputation, the leash. She had believed she was marrying her way permanently out of ever owing anyone anything. Instead, she had married the most indebted man in the county. "Mom," Ethan said, voice cracking, "say something." So I said the one thing I actually had. "She asked for the truth as a wedding gift, sweetheart. Tell her it's from me." I hung up gently. I slept fine, and I'm not the least bit ashamed to admit it. Thursday afternoon, a silver sedan I recognized pulled into my driveway, and the doorbell rang. It wasn't my son coming to negotiate. It was Pamela. She arrived in full uniform, pearls, a fresh blowout, the smile, and stood on my porch wielding 20 years of committee training like a velvet crowbar. Carol, I think we can all agree things got away from everyone Saturday. Emotions, champagne. But what you're doing now, lawyers, formal letters to your own child, family doesn't invoice family. I looked at her pearls and thought about pale rectangles on old wallpaper. Funny, I said. I've been the invoice for 9 years. You've been reading my line items since the engagement party. Her smile held its shape, but her eyes turned to gravel. She tried flattery next, then history, then finally the real message underneath all of it, how this would look. Relatives were already talking, she said. A mother who detonates her only son's wedding over a seating chart. That's the sentence people would repeat at every family gathering in the county for years, and sentences like that have a way of sticking. She left with her heels crisp on my front walk, and I'll be honest, because this story is worthless if I'm not, that visit worked on me for about 6 hours. Denise came over that evening with wine and righteous fury and a full strategy. Post every invoice publicly, she said. Let the whole county read exactly who hosted what. And for one long, bright, ugly moment, I genuinely wanted that. The public reckoning. The vindication tour. Then I set it down. No, I told her. Then I'd just be her with better math. Theater is the family business they'd built. Mine has always been books that balance quietly, in the dark. But that night the house felt very empty. I dug out the photo album Marcus never knew I still kept updating and found Ethan at 8 years old, gap-toothed on our old porch, holding up a fish like a trophy. I sat with my thumb hovering over Frank's number for a long while. Undo it. Buy him back. You already know the price. You've been paying it for years. I set the phone down, unpressed. A few mornings later, a familiar engine idled in my driveway for a full minute before finally shutting off. Ethan alone. He sat where he always sat, at the same kitchen table, third chair, the one with the loose leg he'd wobbled at 15 while charming his father out of a punishment. He looked terrible, new husband terrible, barely 2 weeks in, exhausted, overwhelmed, a man just beginning to understand what his own signature actually weighed. I made him coffee anyway. Cream, too much sugar, exactly how he's taken it since high school, because the day I stop knowing that is the day they can bury me. He circled the runway again, football, my garden, and then finally landed it, and I understood within the first sentence that the whole speech had been drafted somewhere else and rehearsed on the drive over. Mom, here's the thing. Brooke knows things got out of hand at the reception. She's willing to move past all of it. The note, the transfers, the house, especially the house. If you call Frank, put everything back the way it was and apologize. Not to me. To her. At Thanksgiving, in front of everyone. Just say the stress got to you, that you got carried away with the lawyer stuff. His voice softened in a way that quietly broke something load-bearing in me, because he genuinely meant it kindly. And then you're back in, Mom. Holidays. Sunday dinners. And when we have kids. He let that trail off gently, laying down his best card last. You'll know your grandkids. Brooke promises. There it was. Everything I'd ever wanted, offered back whole, fully priced. The cost. One public apology for something done to me. One signature undoing the only honest paperwork produced in 9 years, and permanent reinstatement to the exact seat I'd always been quietly paying for. Table 9 forever, just with better lighting. I looked at my son's tired, hopeful face. Then I glanced at the drawer by the stove where a white envelope had been sleeping since the wedding night. Every number in my life had eventually balanced, one way or another. My son was offering me the single deal that never would. I want to tell you exactly what I did, because this is the part I'd want another woman to carry in her back pocket for the day she needs it. I didn't raise my voice. I refilled his coffee first. His mother, not his creditor. Then I sat back down across from him at that same old table and told him no. I would not be apologizing at Thanksgiving. A woman had asked 200 people to witness my removal from this family. I would not stand in front of those same people and call that my fault. Not for holidays. Not even for grandchildren. He started to speak, and I laid my hand flat on the table, the old boardroom gesture, and he stopped. But you came here for terms, I said, so here are real ones. And I gave them to him level, like a rate sheet. The house, stay and pay market rent like every other couple his age on that street, or buy it from me at appraisal, real mortgage, their names, their equity, and I would cry at that closing with my whole heart. The note, 200 a month, start whenever he's ready. The plan's already sitting in the envelope Frank sent. No interest games, no ambushes. The gentlest paperwork he'll ever sign in his life. He shook his head slowly, not at the numbers, I think, but at the sheer existence of a mother who had numbers for this. I made myself finish the rest, because it was mine to own. I paid for everything all these years, so I'd never have to find out whether you'd stay if I didn't. That was my lie, sweetheart. I ran it for 9 years, and it cost more than any house ever could. I'm done. I reached across and put my hand over his, over the wedding band. I will always be your mother. I am done being your bank. He pulled back, out of reach. My charming boy, his father's laugh wrapped around his wife's script, stood up from my table and found the one sentence with an actual blade in it. Then you're going to be alone, Mom. You get that, right? She's not coming back from this. I let it land. It was, after all, exactly the bill I'd spent 9 years avoiding, finally arriving, fully itemized. Maybe I said, but I'll be somebody's mother, not somebody's money. Whenever you can tell the difference, my door still works fine. He left. The truck door. The engine. Gravel under tires. Then just the kitchen clock, a cooling mug with too much sugar in it, and me. I sat in my quiet, entirely paid-for house, holding his mug with both hands, and let it be true. I had gotten myself back whole at full retail price. It had cost, apparently, exactly 1 son. A winter is long enough to learn the shape of a new kind of quiet. The world, for the record, did not applaud me. Brooke's wedding album went up online under a title like Best Day Ever, not a single frame with me in it, which by then read less like an insult and more like accurate bookkeeping. Pamela's version of events made its rounds through the extended family, and 2 cousins stopped returning my calls entirely. At church, Marie squeezed my arm hard enough to leave a mark, which is how women like us say I know the truth, honey, without saying it out loud. The Sinclairs are still the Sinclairs. No lightning found them. That particular machine had been running long before I ever showed up, and it'll keep running long after. I never expected to shut it down. I only expected to stop feeding it my son's rent money. Speaking of which, they stayed. Full market rent, $2,300, arrives by bank transfer on the 1st of every month. No note attached. No signature beyond what's legally required. It is the coldest money I have ever received in my life, and also the cleanest. Thanksgiving happened at Denise's house that year. 11 people, paper napkins, a turkey she somehow overcooked into something resembling jerky. I laughed more that day than I had in 2 years, and missed my son so fiercely I had to stand in the bathroom for a full minute with the fan running to cover it. Both things were completely true at once. Nobody warns you that getting your spine back comes with a full set of ribs, and every single one of them aches for a while. Then, in the 2nd week of March, a thin envelope arrived, my name and address in Ethan's handwriting, unchanged since middle school. No letter inside. No apology. Just a check for $200, and on the memo line a single word, March. I sat down at my kitchen table and held that small check for a long time. The first payment ever made on that note, for years after it was signed. Nobody had wired it, recycled it, or dressed it up in an excuse. It was money moving in the open, from his own name toward his own debt, under the actual truth of what it was. I drove to the bank and deposited it like any properly documented receivable, because that's what respect looks like in my language. The white envelope, the check, the forgiven note, the letter about the deed, sits in my safety deposit box now, right beside the deed itself. I never shredded it. The gift is still there. So is the door. Both of them stay open for whoever finally decides to knock honestly. In April, a second check arrived. Memo line, April. Underneath it, in smaller writing, tell Aunt Denise the turkey story made Brooke's mom flinch. It's a start. A small one. But it's real, and it's a start. I turned 60 this summer. And here is the one thing I understand now that I didn't understand back at table 9. If the only seat your family reserves for you is the one your money is sitting in, stand up. Because you can give a family everything and still never once be truly invited. And anyone who forgets the difference was never counting you as family, only counting on what family could be counted on to provide. That's my story. A place card with the wrong first letter. A champagne flute set down gently, still full. One phone call from a terrace, 14 minutes long, no shouting involved. And a thin little check in the mail that simply said March. If you've ever paid for a seat you weren't actually welcome in, if you've ever been the wallet in somebody else's family photo, tell me about it below. Because I read every single comment, and there are far more of us at table 9 than anyone likes to admit.